some considerations on the modern empiricism and existentialism, stemming from, let's just take it for granted that Hume is at the David Hume is at the center of a lot of thought. The thought that is now holding sway, as it were, to use a kind of Heideggerian phrase, holding sway, or in power, but in more the terms that Leo Strauss uses. Some scholars are saying that they think Hume's the treatise on human nature, is more worthwhile than the later works on the understanding, for the reason that the first work is more inchoate and it shows the wounds, as it were, of a thinker. There's all kinds of loose ends and threads to unravel for somebody who investigates that, whereas the later work, he tried to polish it so much that it becomes a closed system, as it were. The big vexation in empiricism, for example, let's bring in Peterson. As we go along, what we're doing in these podcasts is we show in this way what thinking is by thinking, and what I just said about the incoherentness and the tatteredness of thought is where we show how thought finds its paths and unfolds itself. In Peterson, for instance, with the connection to Jung, I think of that Carl Jung, and Peterson as psychologist is still on this path started by Krafft Ebing in the heart of this reception of a certain form of empiricism after empiricism had been thought for considerable amount of time since Jung. So Krafft Ebing is like, I think he came out with the book that influenced Carl Jung around, 1850 or something like that. A little while later, I think, actually, even. But when Jung was considering what he was going to go into, originally thinking of archaeology, he read this book on the psychiatric disorders, medical doctors who were dealing with pathologies which didn't obviously have a physical etiology where you can point to something physically wrong with the person. Part of the marginalization of people like Jung is due to the view that is the propaganda that's now pushed from the social engineering side of the technological essence, which gives examples such as that example about the man who had a piece of metal shot into his head and then he lost his moral center and started doing all kinds of crazy things, then saying that all the psychiatric handbooks are really always pointing to things which, as the experimental psychology likes to take for granted, must have a physiological origin. Something goes wrong with the brain, therefore, like cancer in the brain, then the moral behavior goes wrong, something like that. That makes absolutely no sense, because then you can't explain the brain working correctly in the cannibal society where all the cannibals think the brain's working correctly. This guy's sane, he's a cannibal. It just takes for granted the ground of the norms. So there was a time when empiricism meant looking. It was basically like we have communities of people doing observation, like Krafft Ebing in his clinic or wherever he was with his confreres or his colleagues. And the basic thing of the the notion of the empiricism was that he could compare his diagnosis, his judgment of what's going on with his colleagues, and this formed a kind of and whether the observations would be accepted or not accepted, and how to put them in order as the kind of data, and then compare it to other things and be able to, in some way, exert measurement and therefore make it more and more positive, like things that were already given are already there, defecticity. Then Carl Jung picks up this kind of notion of empiricism based on the observation of qualified people of anything. Then you have these basic problems which are already visible kind of in Hume, which in the taken from let's say 10,000 feet up in the sky, what it means is the background of any empiricism is the notion that there's something that's not empirical, which is that the human judgment and other basic human faculties, the ability to measure, the ability to compare, are a priori, as it were. They can't be the subject of whether they're right or wrong, whether they're functioning correctly or not functioning correctly, can't be the subject of an observation. It has to be taken for granted as the arche, or the ground of the whole empiricism. And so then empiricism has gone in kind of two directions. One is the positivism, where you try to conceal as much as possible, although of course it's not put it that way, where you try to make everything as much as possible into measurement and comparison, so you don't have to deal with the notion of the judgment or of that which comes from the daily life. I think of in Tarkovsky, Andrei Tarkovsky, the great director, his film, I think in the book Sculpting in Time, he mentions that in the his great film is the Andrei Rublev, the ecstatic and magisterial work on the icon painter. He says this thing on sort of in the line of the lines of the historian Burckhardt, focusing on the daily life. He makes this comment of like we the filmmakers had to think of what it was all like what daily life was like. So you have this image of Russia 600 years ago, and it's a theoretical image, as it were. It's divorced from the daily life, what people are like. This is the problem with empiricism. The way people are in the daily life changes, so then the way the community